The city was a monster of glass and steel, its lights blurring into cold tears against the night. For Sofia Morales, each skyscraper was a tombstone, marking a life she couldn't have. 8 months pregnant, she felt the city's indifference in the biting wind that sliced through her thin coat. She was a ghost, haunting streets paved with gold, invisible to the hurried footsteps that echoed around her. In her pocket, her fingers clutched the only warmth she had left, a faded ultrasound photo, a fragile promise of a life that depended entirely on her. She had been disowned by her family, abandoned by the man who promised her forever, and now the shelter doors were closed. The baby kicked, a frantic reminder that she wasn't just fighting for one life, but two. A wave of pain, sharp and cruel, crashed over her. It wasn't like the others. This one stole her breath, buckled her knees, and threatened to pull her down to the merciless pavement. Her vision swam, the city's brilliant lights dissolving into a dizzying smear. Panic clawed at her throat. To fall now, here, on this cold stone, could mean the end of everything. It wasn't a thought. It was a primal terror. The world narrowed to a single, desperate need, to stay upright, to shield the precious life she carried from the impact. Her body was a battlefield, and she was losing. She felt the life inside her shudder with the contraction, a silent scream that only she could hear, a plea she had no one to answer. Instinct took over. As a figure of purpose and power strode past her, a blur of expensive wool and cold cologne, her hand shot out. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflex, a drowning woman grabbing for a lifeline. Her chapped fingers, trembling and weak, closed around the man's perfectly tailored sleeve. The grip was clumsy, desperate, an anchor against the violent tide of pain pulling her under. From the outside, it looked like an assault, a beggar's aggressive plea or a thief's clumsy attempt. But the narrator knew the truth. She wasn't reaching for his wallet. She was reaching for solid ground. She wasn't asking for a handout. She was fighting to keep her child from being born on the unforgiving concrete. The man, Damien Croft, was a fortress unto himself. He moved through the world as if he owned it, his mind 1,000 miles away, lost in a world of multi-million-dollar deals and hostile takeovers. The phone pressed to his ear was a shield against the messy, unpredictable chaos of human life. He felt the sudden, desperate grip on his arm, not as a plea for help, but as an inconvenience, a stain on the perfect fabric of his evening. He didn't see a woman on the verge of collapse. He saw a nuisance, another piece of the city's grime he had to navigate. His world was built on control and precision, and this raw, unscripted touch was a violation of the cold, orderly universe he had constructed around himself. He ripped his arm away with a sharp, contemptuous jerk, the force nearly sending Sofia to the ground. "Get your hands off me," he hissed, his voice like ice, not even bothering to look her in the face. "I don't have time for this." The words were daggers, each one finding its mark in a heart already broken. He saw only a problem to be dismissed, an obstacle to be sidestepped. He didn't see the terror in her eyes or the protective way her hands flew to her swollen belly as she doubled over with a muffled cry. He turned to walk away, his important call already reclaiming his attention. He left her there, a lone ship sinking in a sea of indifference under the cold, watchful eyes of the city he had built. Left reeling on the cold sidewalk, Sofia gasped for air as Damien Croft's dismissive words echoed in her mind, colder than the wind that whipped around the corner. The pain from the contraction receded, but it was replaced by a dizzying wave of exhaustion and a thirst so profound it felt like her throat was lined with sand. She stumbled, leaning against the unforgiving glass of a storefront, her reflection a ghostly image of a woman she no longer recognized. Her body screamed for water, for a single calorie of energy, not for herself but for the tiny, restless life that depended on her for everything. The city's abundance was a cruel joke, a feast laid out behind an impenetrable wall of glass, and she was starving on the other side. Her desperate gaze fell upon a small, elegant outdoor cafe, its tables mostly empty in the late evening chill. On one, a patron had left behind a half-full bottle of premium water, its label promising purity and refreshment. To Sofia, it wasn't just water, it was life. It was a chance to quell the fire in her throat and gather the strength for the next wave of pain. A war raged within her, Every value she had ever held told her it was wrong, a line she should never cross. But the primal, fierce instinct of a mother protecting her child was a far more powerful force. Her baby needed this. That single, desperate thought drowned out the whispers of her conscience, replacing them with a singular, urgent mission. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed herself away from the wall. Each step was a negotiation with her own body, a painful shuffle toward the table. She tried to make herself small, invisible, a shadow moving among other shadows. Her hand, trembling uncontrollably, reached out. It wasn't the slick, practiced move of a thief, but a clumsy, desperate snatch. Her fingers closed around the cool plastic, the simple object feeling as precious as a diamond in her grasp. She didn't look around. She didn't think. She just turned to flee, to find a hidden alley where she could drink this stolen salvation and prepare for what was coming next. It was an act of pure survival, raw and unadorned. "Hey, stop right there!" The voice was sharp, accusatory, and it sliced through the night air like a siren. The cafe's manager, a man in a crisp white apron, stormed out from the doorway, his face a mask of indignation. He pointed a finger at her, his eyes filled not with concern, but with cold, righteous anger. "Put that back. Right now. You think you can just walk up and steal from my customers?" He didn't see a pregnant woman in agony. He saw a problem, a stain on his pristine establishment, a piece of the city's refuse that had dared to cross into his world. His voice was loud, drawing the attention of the few remaining patrons and passers-by. Instantly, Sophia became the center of a cruel, impromptu theater of judgment. A couple seated nearby pulled their expensive coats tighter, their faces etched with disgust. "Unbelievable," the woman muttered to her partner, loud enough for Sophia to hear. "No shame at all." Another man, walking past, slowed his pace, shaking his head with a sigh of weary disapproval. They saw exactly what they expected to see: a homeless person, a thief, a drain on society. Not one of them saw the swollen curve of her belly hidden beneath the thin coat, or the sheer terror that swam in her wide, haunted eyes. The truth of her desperation was invisible, erased by the simple, damning story they had already written for her. Frozen in the spotlight of their scorn, Sophia clutched the water bottle to her chest as if it were her own child. The humiliation was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs more effectively than any contraction. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. What could she say? How could she explain a lifetime of pain and a moment of desperate instinct to faces carved from stone? Her dignity, the last tattered remnant of her former life, was being shredded before their eyes. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the concrete, to become the ghost they already believed her to be. But she couldn't. She could only stand there, exposed and broken. The manager took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I'm calling the police," he threatened, pulling out his phone. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for people like you." The phrase "people like you" hung in the air, a final, brutal verdict. He wasn't speaking to her anymore. He was performing for his audience, reinforcing the barrier between his world of order and her world of chaos. To him, she was not a person in crisis. She was a statistic, a nuisance to be removed, a lesson to be taught. The bottle of water, worth less than $1, had become the pretext for a public execution of her spirit. They saw a thief trying to steal a bottle of water. They didn't see a mother trying to save her baby's life. They saw a crime, but the narrator saw an act of unconditional love, a desperate prayer in a world that had stopped listening. The line between right and wrong blurs when survival is the only choice left on the table. How many of us walk past a story like Sophia's every single day, seeing only the surface, never the crushing weight beneath? If this story is touching your heart, like and share it. There are so many who fight this battle in silence, waiting for just one person to see beyond the judgment. Just a few yards away, shielded from the raw drama by the tinted glass of a chauffeured sedan, Damien Croft ended a phone call that had just added another flaw to his empire. The world outside his window was a silent film, a series of muted gestures he rarely bothered to interpret. He was a man who lived in the sky, in penthouses and boardrooms, and the life on the pavement below was little more than an abstraction. The distant shouts from the cafe were an unwelcome intrusion, a crack in the soundproof bubble he had so carefully constructed around his life. He saw the commotion not as a human crisis, but as a flaw in the city's design, a messy, inefficient variable in an otherwise predictable system. His chauffeur, a man trained in the art of invisibility, cleared his throat. "Shall we go, Mr. Croft?" But Damien's gaze was now fixed on the scene. It was the ugliness of it that caught his attention, the manager's self-important posturing, the crowd's vulture-like curiosity. He despised public displays of weakness and the messy emotions that fueled them. His world was one of calculated risks and controlled outcomes, and this raw, chaotic spectacle offended his sense of order. He looked at the woman at its center, a huddled shape of fear and desperation, and felt a familiar, cold wave of disdain. He saw not a person, but a symptom of a world he had long since detached himself from. As he watched, a detail sharpened into focus, the half-empty bottle of premium water clutched in the woman's hand. He recognized the distinct label. It was his. He had left it on that very table not 10 minutes earlier, a forgotten casualty of a call that had been worth millions. The realization did not spark anger. It was a flicker of profound annoyance, the kind one feels when a fly lands in a glass of expensive wine. His property, however insignificant, had become the centerpiece of this pathetic street theater. This minor inconvenience had now become his problem, a loose thread he felt compelled to snip before it unraveled his perfectly scheduled evening. With a sigh of irritation, he opened the car door. He moved with an aura of absolute authority that parted the small crowd like the sea. His presence was a silent, powerful declaration of importance, his tailored suit a suit of armor against the grime of the world. He didn't look at Sophia. His eyes, cold and sharp as shards of glass, were fixed on the manager, who immediately faltered under the weight of his gaze. "Is there a problem?" Damien asked. The voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable weight, a low growl of command that expected immediate compliance. It was not a question of concern. It was an order to restore silence, to erase this messy human stain from his path. The manager, now stammering and eager to please this powerful new arrival, pointed a trembling finger at Sophia. "Sir, Mr. Croft, that's your water. This woman, she just took it. I was handling it." Damien's gaze finally shifted to Sophia, sweeping over her in a cold, clinical assessment. He saw the worn-out coat, the dirt under her fingernails, the sheer terror in her eyes. His mind processed the data and returned a swift, brutal verdict. Homeless, desperate, a liability. He felt nothing for her. Not pity, not anger, just the weary impatience of a king bothered by the pleas of a commoner. She was an obstacle, and he knew exactly how to remove obstacles. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat, but it wasn't a phone to call the police. He withdrew a thick black leather wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He didn't offer it to Sophia. He held it out to the manager, a transactional dismissal of the entire situation. "This should cover the damages," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so cold it could freeze water. "Now, let her go." He was not offering help. He was buying silence. He was paying to have this woman and her inconvenient suffering scrubbed from his reality, reducing her entire existence to the price of a minor nuisance. But Sophia did not move. She looked from the money in the manager's hand to the cold emptiness in Damien's eyes, and something inside her broke. This gesture was a deeper wound than any of the insults. It was an erasure of her humanity, with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She took a shaky step forward and looked directly at him. "I don't want your money," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of defiance in the cold night. She let the bottle of water drop from her numb fingers, where it clattered on the pavement. "I was thirsty." Her words were simple, a plain and devastating truth that hung in the air, dismantling the narrative of greed they had all built around her. Her refusal was a fault line in Damien's perfectly ordered world. People like her were supposed to be predictable. They were supposed to take the money. Her quiet dignity was a variable he had not accounted for, an act of defiance that his logic could not process. For the first time all night, he truly saw her. He saw the deep, purple shadows of exhaustion under her eyes. He saw the way her hand instinctively, protectively, cradled her swollen stomach. And in that gesture, in that fierce, maternal instinct to protect, he saw the ghost of a memory he had spent 5 years trying to bury. The world around him faded. The deal, the car, the city, it all disappeared. There was only the woman, her pain, and an echo of his own. The silence that followed her words was heavier than the city's oppressive hum. The small crowd, which had gathered for a spectacle of judgment, now stood in awkward confusion. The manager's righteous anger deflated, leaving him looking foolish and small. For Damien Croft, the world had tilted on its axis. Her simple, devastating truth, "I was thirsty," had bypassed all his defenses, striking a nerve he thought had died 5 years ago. He stood frozen. The architect of 1,000 cold facades, his own meticulously constructed world, beginning to crack under the weight of 3 small words. He saw her, truly saw her, and the image was a mirror reflecting a pain he could no longer ignore. His carefully curated indifference was a lie, and the proof was standing right in front of him, trembling but unbroken. With a barely perceptible motion, Damien raised a hand, a silent command that dismissed the onlookers. They dispersed like startled birds, sensing a shift in power they did not understand. He then turned his gaze to the manager, a look so cold and final that the man flinched and retreated into his cafe without another word. The street was suddenly theirs, an isolated stage under the glow of the city lights. He took a hesitant step toward Sophia, his movements stiff, unfamiliar. "You need a doctor," he stated, the words clipped and devoid of warmth. It wasn't an offer of compassion, it was a clinical diagnosis, the observation of a problem that required a solution. He was still the man who fixed things, who managed crises, but this crisis felt dangerously, terrifyingly personal. Sophia flinched at his words, recoiling as if he had tried to strike her. Her pride, the last fortress she had, rose to her defense. "I don't need anything from you," she said, her voice thin but laced with steel. She had learned the hard way what help from powerful men cost. It was a debt that was never fully paid. She tried to turn, to walk away, to reclaim her invisibility and disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But her body betrayed her. A fresh wave of pain seized her, forcing a sharp gasp from her lips. She staggered, her hand flying to a nearby lamppost to steady herself. She was a prisoner in her own body. And her escape attempt had failed before it even began. The cold metal of the post was an anchor in a storm she could no longer navigate alone. Just then, the silent, polished door of the sedan opened. Damien's chauffeur, a man named Arthur, whose face was a study in professional neutrality, stepped out. "Sir, your 10 o'clock meeting with the board," he announced, his voice a calm reminder of the world Damien actually belonged to, a world of schedules, deadlines, and billion-dollar consequences. Arthur's eyes flickered toward Sophia for a fraction of a second, his expression unreadable but carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. He saw a complication, a delay, a messy piece of street life soiling his employer's immaculate evening. His presence was a stark reminder of the chasm between their 2 worlds, a silent pressure for Damien to disengage and return to the life that was waiting for him. A war was being waged behind Damien's eyes. The Iron Architect, the ruthless tycoon, urged him to cut his losses, to get in the car and forget this ever happened. It was the logical, efficient, and safe thing to do. But another voice, a ghost from his past, whispered a warning. He saw his wife, Sarah, her face pale with fear in the twisted metal of their car, her hands protectively over her own swollen belly. He had been powerless then, a king with no army to fight fate. To walk away now felt like a second betrayal, a repetition of his greatest failure. The 10 o'clock meeting was just money. This felt like a reckoning. He was trapped between the man he had become and the man he had been, frozen by a choice he never wanted to make. He tried to regain control the only way he knew how, through transaction. He looked at Sophia, his expression hardening again into a mask of cold pragmatism. "I will take you to a hospital," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I will cover all the costs. This is not a request. It is a statement of fact." He was framing it as an acquisition, a problem to be managed and resolved with his vast resources. He was deliberately stripping the emotion from the act, trying to convince himself that this was just another business deal. He wasn't helping a person. He was containing a liability. This was a language he understood, a framework that kept the terrifying ghost of empathy at bay. But Sophia heard the unspoken words. She heard the dismissal, the implication that she was just another line item on his ledger. "I am not a problem for you to solve," she shot back, her voice shaking with a mixture of pain and indignation. I am not a contract to be signed or a debt to be paid off. She was refusing to be categorized, to be made small, to have her humanity stripped away and replaced with a price tag. In her world, dignity was the only currency that mattered, and she refused to sell hers, even for the promise of safety. She would rather face this alone, on her own terms, than be a charitable project for a man who looked at her as if she were a flaw in his perfect cityscape. As she spoke, another contraction, more vicious than the last, ripped through her. Her knees buckled, and a cry of pure agony escaped her lips. The lamppost was no longer enough. She began to fall. In that split second, all of Damien's calculations, all his cold logic evaporated. Instinct took over. He lunged forward, catching her before she hit the pavement. His hands, which had only known the feel of contracts and keyboards for 5 years, were now holding the fragile weight of this woman and her unborn child. The touch was electric, a current of raw, terrifying humanity that short-circuited his entire being. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant, his suit of armor shattered by a simple, involuntary act of support. As if summoned by the drama, the flashing blue and red lights of a police car swept across the street, painting their faces in harsh, alternating colors. The manager had made the call. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions weary, and their posture immediately communicating their bias. They saw a wealthy man in a tailored suit and a disheveled woman clinging to him. Their minds filled in the blanks with a story they had seen 1,000 times: vagrancy, harassment, public disturbance. "Is there a problem here, sir?" one of them asked, his question directed solely at Damien, completely ignoring Sophia as if she were merely part of the scenery. The system had arrived, ready to reinforce the very walls Damien was just beginning to see. Damien didn't hesitate. He held Sophia steady, his grip firm, and turned to the officers. His voice was transformed, shedding its internal conflict and adopting a tone of pure, uncut authority. "There is no problem here, officers. This woman is with me. We were just leaving." He spoke with the effortless command of a man who had never been questioned in his life. The police, recognizing the power radiating from him, simply nodded and retreated to their car. Damien then looked down at Sophia, his eyes still holding a storm of conflicting emotions, but his voice was absolute. "You're getting in my car," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a verdict, a desperate act of control, driven by a fear he refused to name, from a man who had just lost control of everything. The ride to the hospital began in a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight inside the cavernous luxury of the sedan. Damien's hands, usually steady and decisive as they signed billion-dollar contracts, were clamped onto the leather steering wheel, his knuckles white. He drove with a mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on the road, but his mind was a chaotic storm. Sophia was curled into the passenger seat, a small wounded shape against the opulent interior. She tried to muffle the pained gasps that escaped with each contraction, her shame warring with her agony. He was a man defined by control. Yet every element of this situation, her pain, her presence, the ghost she had awakened, was utterly beyond his command. The city lights smeared past the windows, no longer symbols of his power, but cold, indifferent witnesses to his unraveling. He had expected a performance. He had braced himself for a torrent of tears, a fabricated sob story designed to exploit his wealth, a litany of demands. But Sophia offered none of it. Instead, she focused inward. Her entire being concentrated on the simple, rhythmic act of breathing. It was a fragile anchor in the hurricane of pain, a small pocket of control in a life that had spun into chaos. Damien watched her from the corner of his eye, his cynicism baffled by her quiet fortitude. This wasn't the weakness he despised, it was a form of strength he couldn't comprehend. Her dignity was a silent, powerful force, an unbroken thing that had no right to exist in the face of such utter destitution. It was a profound and unsettling mystery. That sound, the soft, controlled rhythm of her breathing, was a key unlocking a door he had long since bolted shut. It was the same pattern, the same quiet, desperate count his wife, Sarah, had practiced in the months leading up to the due date that never came. The memory ambushed him, visceral and suffocating. He wasn't in his car anymore. He was in a sunlit room holding Sarah's hand, her laughter filling the space as she practiced for a future that was already a ghost. A wave of grief, sharp and potent as it was 5 years ago, crashed over him. The past was no longer a distant country. It was here, a living, breathing passenger in the seat beside him, and its presence was unbearable. As the pain of a particularly vicious contraction began to fade, Sophia's hand, shaking with exhaustion, moved toward the pocket of her threadbare coat. Damien's body tensed, an automatic reflex born of a lifetime of suspicion. His mind, the cold architect of his empire, ran through a list of cynical possibilities. A knife, a ploy, a hidden object to further her deception. He prepared himself for a threat, for the other shoe to finally drop. But what she pulled from the worn fabric was not a weapon. It was a small, creased photograph, its edges softened by countless touches, an ultrasound photo. She didn't brandish it at him or use it as a prop. She simply held it, her gaze fixed on it, her thumb stroking the tiny, ghostly image of her reason for living. His eyes locked onto the photograph, and the world tilted. It was a symbol he knew intimately, a fragile promise he had once held in his own hands. He remembered the overwhelming, terrifying wave of love that had washed over him when he first saw the grainy image of his own child. That picture had been his North Star, the focal point of all his hopes. To see its twin, its perfect emotional replica, in the hand of this destitute stranger, was a collision of two universes. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a sacred text, a testament to a love that was identical to his own, a love that had been stolen from him. In that moment, the chasm of wealth and status between them evaporated, leaving only the common sacred ground of parenthood. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, not meant for him, but for the image in her hand. "I just need you to be safe," she breathed. The words a raw and simple prayer. That's all that matters. You just have to be okay. There was no manipulation in her tone, no hint of a plea for his charity. It was the pure, unvarnished confession of a mother's heart, a selfless vow that transcended her own suffering. Damien had built his world on the assumption that everyone had an angle, that every action was a transaction. Her words shattered that foundation. He had seen a thief, a problem, a liability, but he was wrong. He was witnessing an act of love so absolute it eclipsed everything else, a force more powerful than any empire he could ever build. The revelation was a physical blow. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't see the road. With a sharp, jerky motion, he pulled the car over, slamming it into park on a deserted, lamplit street. The engine's powerful hum was the only sound in the sudden, suffocating stillness. He stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the glittering skyline he had conquered, but he saw none of it. He saw only the twisted metal of a car wreck, heard the distant wail of sirens, felt the phantom touch of his wife's cold hand. The fortress he had built around his heart, meticulously constructed over 5 agonizing years, began to fracture. A single and hot tear escaped his eye, a traitor to his composure, carving a burning path down his cheek. It was the first he'd shed since the day he buried his future. "I lost one too." The words were torn from him, a raw, ragged confession that scraped his throat on the way out. It wasn't the voice of Damien Croft, the titan of industry. It was the voice of a broken man, a ghost haunting a life he no longer recognized. "My wife. We were having a baby." He offered no more, the details too sacred and too painful to speak aloud, but he didn't have to. The shared, unspeakable truth of their loss filled the space between them, creating a fragile bridge of understanding across an impossible divide. He had just handed this complete stranger the heaviest, most broken piece of his soul, an act of vulnerability so profound it terrified him. He felt exposed, stripped bare under the cold city lights. Sophia slowly turned her head, her own immense pain receding in the face of his. She looked at him, and the powerful, intimidating millionaire vanished. In his place was a man drowning in the same ocean of grief she navigated every single day. She saw the hollow ache in his eyes, a reflection of her own. She offered no empty words of sympathy, no hollow condolences. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She reached out her hand, the one not clutching the ultrasound photo, and laid it gently on his forearm. It was the same arm she had grabbed in terror, the same arm he had pulled away in disgust. But this touch was different. It wasn't a desperate plea for help. It was a quiet offering of shared humanity. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He let her hand rest there, a small, warm anchor in the cold storm of his grief. Her simple, silent gesture was an absolution he never knew he needed. In that moment, she ceased to be an abstract problem or a symbol of his past failure. She became real, a woman of incredible strength, a mother of profound courage, a fellow traveler in the land of the lost. He looked from her hand to her face, and the last remnants of the iron architect dissolved into dust. The world stopped spinning. A new clarity, a new purpose, forged itself in the fire of his pain and her compassion. He would not let history repeat itself. He would not fail again. "We're going to the hospital," he said, and his voice was steady, filled with a resolve that was no longer about control, but about redemption. "Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear your story." The harsh, sterile white of the hospital room was a world away from the unforgiving grey of the city streets. Damien did not leave. He sat in a stiff plastic chair in the hallway, a titan of industry reduced to a silent, helpless sentinel. He refused calls from his board, ignored urgent emails that pinged on his phone, and waved away nurses who offered him coffee. He was a man who measured his life in minutes and millions, yet he spent hours just listening for the steady, rhythmic beep of a fetal heart monitor, a sound that was both a ghost of his past and a prayer for Sophia's future. He wasn't just paying a debt, he was bearing witness. For Sophia, lying in the clean, quiet room, his presence was a strange and powerful anchor. He offered no words of comfort, but his silent, unwavering vigil spoke a language of protection she hadn't heard in years. When the baby arrived, a healthy girl with a surprisingly strong cry, the sound echoed down the sterile corridor and into the deepest, most wounded part of Damien's soul. He stood outside the delivery room, his hand pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching a miracle he thought he would never see again. This was not a moment of joy for him. Not yet. It was a moment of profound, earth-shattering relief, a quiet exhale he had been holding in for 5 years. He saw Sophia, exhausted but radiant, hold her daughter for the first time, and in her eyes, he saw not the victim he had almost destroyed, but a warrior who had won her war. The tiny, perfect life in that room was a testament to a strength he had never known, and it began to heal a wound he believed was fatal. Justice had not come from money or power, but from a single, healthy heartbeat. A few days later, he approached her not with pity, but with a proposal. He presented it like a business deal, his voice carefully neutral, his hands holding a simple, unmarked key. "I own a number of corporate apartments," he stated, avoiding her gaze. "One is currently vacant. It makes no financial sense for it to sit empty." He wasn't offering a home. He was presenting a logistical solution. He was using the cold language of his world to perform an act of profound compassion. Sophia looked from the key to his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so desperately to hide behind a mask of pragmatism. She understood. This wasn't charity. It was his own form of penance, his own attempt at rebuilding. With a quiet nod, she accepted. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady. She wasn't accepting a handout, she was accepting a truce. The apartment was not a palace. It was a simple, clean space high above the city, its large window looking out over the very streets that had been her prison. But to Sophia, it was a sanctuary. The first thing she did was lock the door. The simple click of the deadbolt a sound more beautiful than any music. She held her daughter, who she had named Hope, and walked to the window. The city lights no longer felt like cold, indifferent eyes. They were just lights. For the first time in months, she was not exposed, not hunted, not invisible. She was safe. This was the true reward. Not the furniture or the view, but the silence, the warmth, and the profound, soul-deep peace that came from knowing her child would sleep through the night in a place of absolute security. She had not been given a new life. She had been given the ground on which to build one herself. Damien's final offer came a week later. He didn't offer her money, he offered her a purpose. "My foundation has an opening," he said, placing a folder on the small table between them. "We need someone to manage outreach for a new program supporting single mothers facing homelessness, someone who understands, someone with strength." He looked at her directly then, his eyes stripped of all pretense. "This is not a gift, Ms. Morales. It is a job. You've earned it." He was giving her back the one thing he had almost taken from her, her dignity, reforged and made stronger. He saw her not as a project to be fixed, but as an asset. Sophia opened the folder, her hands steady. She was no longer a victim of the system. He was inviting her to help change it. The cycle of pain was broken, replaced by a chance to turn her deepest scars into a beacon for others. 6 months later, the city was no longer a monster. From the window of her apartment, its lights were a constellation of promises, a map of the future she was now building. Sophia Morales was not the ghost who haunted these streets. She was a quiet force, a woman remade not by charity, but by opportunity. She moved with a calm purpose, her daughter, hope, a warm, steady weight against her heart. The silence of her home was not the terrifying silence of abandonment, but the sacred quiet of safety. Every morning, she would hold her daughter and look out at the skyline, no longer seeing a wall of indifference, but a world of possibility. She had not been given a new life. She had been given the tools and the ground to construct her own, piece by dignified piece. Miles away, in a penthouse that had once been a monument to his grief, Damien Croft was also learning a new architecture. The blueprints for skyscrapers were replaced by reports from his foundation, charts that measured not profit margins, but lives changed. The silence of his home was no longer an echo of loss, but a space for quiet contemplation. On his desk, next to photos of multi-million-dollar properties, sat a small, simple frame holding a picture of baby Hope. He looked at it not with sadness for what he had lost, but with a profound, humbling gratitude for what he had found. He had spent 5 years building towers to touch the sky, trying to outrun a memory. Now, he was learning to build something far more lasting, a legacy of compassion. Their worlds, once collided in violence and judgment, now intersected with a quiet, professional respect. At the foundation, Sophia was not a project. She was a partner. She spoke with an authority born from experience, her voice steady and clear as she outlined strategies to help women who were walking the same path she had. Damien would often sit in the back of these meetings, a silent observer. He wasn't watching a former victim he had saved. He was watching a leader he had empowered. He had opened a door, but it was her own strength, her own resilience, that had walked through it and lit up the room. He had thought he was offering a hand up, but he quickly realized she had been the one to pull him out of his own darkness. One crisp autumn afternoon, Damien visited the apartment, the pretense of a landlord's inspection long since abandoned. He came bearing not gifts of obligation, but a small, stuffed bear, an offering of simple, human connection. With a hesitant reverence, he asked if he could hold Hope. Sophia placed her daughter in his arms, and for a moment, the iron architect disappeared completely. The man holding the child was fragile, his eyes filled with a storm of unshed tears and unspoken memories. The weight of this tiny, perfect life was not a burden, but an anchor, grounding him in a present he had never thought he would have again. In that shared, silent moment, they were not a millionaire and a woman he helped. They were just two survivors, finding healing in the warmth of a new beginning. They were two souls, standing on opposite sides of the same city, forever changed by a single, desperate touch on a cold winter night. Sophia would stand at her window, her daughter asleep in her arms, and see a world she was no longer afraid of. Damien would stand at his, looking down at the river of lights, and see not a kingdom he owned, but a community he belonged to. He had not saved her life. He had simply been present for the moment she saved her own, and in doing so, she had shown him the way back to his. He learned that true strength wasn't in building walls to keep the world out, but in finding the courage to tear them down. He gave her safety, and she gave him back his soul. The story of a hurried man and a pregnant woman could have ended on that cold sidewalk, a forgotten footnote in the city's indifferent narrative, but it didn't. It became a quiet testament to the fact that our deepest wounds are often the very places where the light gets in. Sophia's journey from the pavement to a place of purpose was not a fairy tale. It was a testament to the fierce or an unyielding power of a mother's love and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. And Damien, the man who had everything, discovered that the only thing worth holding on to was the humanity he had almost thrown away. He thought he was just stopping a woman from falling. He never realized he was catching his own heart. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to believe in hope.